Hello and welcome to another coffee break. This time it's gonna be about timers. When you want to perform an action in a periodic manner in your application, you need a timer. And there are actually multiple different timers in WinUI and Uno platform applications. So I would like to look into what these timer types are and when to use which. So let's start with the lowest level one, which is threading timer, so a System.threading.timer. This type is very low level and is implemented directly in the CLR and provides you with a very simple API where you provide a callback, which is called when the timer ticks, then a state, which is arbitrary value that you want to pass to the callback. So you can see that I'm passing in null, but you can pass in any object and it would be then passed in here in the callback handler. And then there are two values. First is due time, which represents the time when the timer first performs its tick. And then there is a period, which represents the interval after which the callback will be repeated. So if I were to write something like this, it would mean that the first tick would happen after 4 seconds after creating the timer, and then it would happen periodically each 500 milliseconds. So in this configuration, it will first tick 500 seconds after creating the timer and then periodically each 500 milliseconds. What happens then is that the callback of the timer is triggered, and in that callback we can perform any action that we want to do periodically. In this case, I'm outputting the current time in a text block. And you can notice that I'm using dispatcher queue here. And that's very important if I want to manipulate the UI in any way. Because if I were not to use it, I would get an exception during execution because the callback of the timer is scheduled on any thread. It's not the UI thread necessarily. So it means that it can happen on any thread, and that might cause an exception because every manipulation of UI thread needs to happen on the UI thread. So you need to make sure that you're using dispatcher queue whenever you are trying to output something on the UI or manipulate the UI in any way. So if I run this now, I will just make sure that I have start and stop timer. So if I run this now, we'll see that it behaves correctly. So now it's starting. If I start the timer, the time is updating here. If I stop it, it's stopped. For the stopping of the timer, the only thing you need to do is to dispose the timer type itself. And you can see I'm using dispose async. And the reason for it is that if you just call the dispose method, the timer will get disposed, but it can still tick one more time if the previous callback was still scheduled for some time later. So if you use dispose async, it will make sure that that it will wait, and the await will wait and continue only after the last tick happens. So this is kind of useful to make that you can make sure that there will be no additional ticks later. After the disposal, I'm just nulling up the object here, so there's just so it's cleaned up for the next use. Alright, so this is the lowest level and easiest and simplest timer. So let's switch to System.timers.timer. This one is basically just a higher level abstraction above system threading timer. It is still not scheduling on the UI thread, so when it's elapsed, you need to make sure that you run it on the dispatcher queue. But otherwise, it's very simple and very easy to use. So just create the timer, set the interval between individual ticks, and when it's elapsed, you pass in some event handler. And after you are done, you just start it and it's running until you call the stop method, which stops the timer from ticking. So again, very simple timer. Let me just show you that it works correctly. So I will comment this, uncomment this one, start it, and you will see basically the same behavior, just now with the system timers timer. So again, time is updating, I stop it, it stops updating. So these are the simplest timers that you can use, especially for scenarios where you don't expect to manipulate the UI thread and you don't really care where the event handler will run, on which thread it will run. But if you want something that actually does work on UI thread, you can use one of the dispatcher timers. The basic one, the most common one, is dispatcher timer, which requires you to create an instance, then set the interval for repeats, and then set the tick handler. Afterwards, you start it, and in the handler of the dispatcher, you can see there is no longer any dispatcher queue code. And the reason is because dispatcher timer is the timer's tick method, tick handler, is scheduled on the UI thread on which you originally created it. So as I'm creating the instance here, now in the button handler, basically it's this is called from the button handler, it will be scheduled on the UI thread of the current page. So I can safely do time text blocks.text equals something, and it will be running on the UI thread, so there will be no problem with setting the value. Finally, when I'm done, I'm stopping the timer, and that makes it stop and no longer tick. So again, let me run this here, and we should see exactly the same behavior with dispatcher timer. So let's start the timer, and it's now updating here, and we're getting the updated values, and I can stop it anytime, and that's it. Finally, there is one more timer, which is called dispatcher queue timer. And the difference between dispatcher timer and dispatcher queue timer is that technically the dispatcher queue timer is a newer one. It's supposed to be used if you're building WinUI applications based on Winamp SDK. And it basically behaves the same way as dispatcher timer, with the only difference that you don't create an instance of it by its constructor, but instead you use a dispatcher queue on which you call the create timer method. This returns you an instance of the dispatcher queue timer, and then it's basically the same as the dispatcher timer, where you set the interval, set the tick, and start the timer, after which the tick handler will be executed again on the UI thread of the dispatcher queue, which in this case I'm using dispatcher queue property of the current page, so it means it's gonna be the UI thread on which the current page is displayed. And again, it will just set the time text value. And finally, when I'm done, I stop the timer like this by calling the stop method. So the API is basically exactly the same as dispatcher timer, except for how we create it. Instead of the constructor, we use the create timer method. So I will run it again. Oh, right, I need to set it as the current timer. So I will just comment this out, uncomment this, and let's run it. And now when I start the timer, you can see the time updating here, and I can stop it anytime, and that's it. So these are all the types of the timers that you can use in your Uno platform and WinUI applications. Basically, your choice drills down to whether you want to schedule the action on the UI thread or not. And if you want to use the UI thread, then use one of the dispatcher timers. And if you don't need the UI thread, then use either threading timer or timers timer. I'll just show you the same thing here in WebAssembly. So if I start the timer, it's ticking and I can stop it anytime. So very simple and very useful. So thank you for joining me for this coffee break. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to get notified about future videos, subscribe. And until then, keep coding and have a great day.